Morning of the 9th century. You are peacefully having breakfast when suddenly a drakkar emerges from the fog, and at its bow stands a bearded giant in a wolf skin, roaring so loudly that your heart stops. Why did these northerners turn fortresses to ashes with just their screams? Was it all about berserker rage, hallucinogenic mushrooms, or the clever propaganda of monks who needed a scary story? Now we will figure out what really frightened Europe. Stay tuned. In a couple of seconds, myths will crumble, and the truth about Vikings will strike your consciousness like an axe. Vikings. This word alone evokes images of bearded warriors with huge axes, horned helmets, and bloodthirsty smiles. But how much does this image correspond to historical reality? Let us dig deeper and find out why these northern seafarers instilled such terror in medieval Europe. And a spoiler right away, they did not have horned helmets. Yes, this symbol of Vikings is merely an invention of 19th century artists and opera productions. Surprised? This is just the beginning of myth-busting. Let us start with the very term Viking. Many think that all Scandinavians of that time were called this, but that is not true. The word Viking comes from Old Norse vikingur, which meant a person going on a sea voyage. That is, one became a Viking, was not born one. It was a profession, not a nationality. Imagine calling all Italians mafiosi or all Russians cosmonauts. This is approximately the same logical error that occurs when we call all inhabitants of early medieval Scandinavia Vikings. But let us return to our main question. Why were they so frightening? The first and perhaps most obvious reason is the element of surprise. Vikings were masters of sudden attacks. Their long ships, drakkars, had shallow drafts, which allowed them to enter shallow rivers and land practically anywhere on the coast. Imagine, you live in a coastal monastery or village. Everything around is peaceful. Birds are singing. And suddenly, out of nowhere, dozens of heavily armed warriors appear. No preparation, no warning. How can you not be scared? Moreover, Vikings perfectly understood the psychological impact of fear. They deliberately cultivated their intimidating image. Before an attack, they could emit frightening battle cries and use noise instruments like horns and drums. And the famous battering ram wedge, a battle formation in the shape of a boar's head, Svin Filking, was not only tactically effective, but also psychologically overwhelming for the opponent. When a wedge of shields and spears rushes at you, with the most experienced and fierce warriors at the front, this sight is not for the faint-hearted. A special place in Viking history belongs to berserkers, warriors who fell into battle frenzy. The word berserker literally means bearskin, or, according to another version, without armor. These warriors could indeed fight without protection, wearing only animal skins, showing inhuman fury and seemingly feeling no pain. Sources describe them as people who howled like wild animals, bit their shields, and were as strong as bears or bulls. What caused this state? There are several theories. One speaks of the use of hallucinogenic substances. For example, fly agaric or other psychoactive mushrooms. Another points to self-hypnosis and psychological techniques for entering trance. A third suggests that berserkers might have suffered from certain mental disorders. Or perhaps it was simply a well-rehearsed combat technique, a kind of psychological preparation for battle. Whatever it was, the effect was stunning. Berserkers instilled fear even in their own comrades. But it was not just their combat qualities that made Vikings frightening. Propaganda also played an important role. Most written sources about Vikings were left by their victims, Christian monks, and, as you understand, they were not interested in creating a positive image of pagans ravaging monasteries. In Chronicles, Vikings are described as merciless savages, messengers of the Antichrist, destroying everything in their path. Monks especially emphasized their cruelty and barbarism. Was this image fair? Both yes and no. On one hand, Vikings did commit brutal raids. They robbed, killed, took slaves. But on the other hand, they were not more cruel than other warriors of that time. Franks, Saxons, Slavs, All of them waged wars with no less cruelty. It is just that Vikings attacked centers of written culture, monasteries where books were kept, and people who could write lived. Therefore, their cruelty was better documented. Interestingly, in Arab sources, Vikings, who were called Rus or Majus there, are described quite differently, as excellent merchants, clean people who took care of their appearance. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab traveler of the 10th century, noted that they washed daily, combed their hair, and took care of their clothes. Not very similar to the image of a dirty savage, is it? Speaking of appearance, Vikings did indeed pay great attention to it. Archaeological findings show that they carried combs, tweezers, ear spoons, and other toiletries. Men dyed their hair and beards, wore complex hairstyles. Women used jewelry and cosmetics. Imagine a stern warrior, having just plundered a monastery, carefully combs his beard and touches up his hair before meeting with his comrades. This image is very different from the stereotypical view of Vikings as unkempt barbarians. Another factor that made Vikings so frightening was their religious beliefs and attitude toward death. For a pagan warrior, death in battle was not a tragedy, but an honor. According to their beliefs, warriors fallen in battle went to Valhalla, the hall of glory, where they feasted with the god Odin and prepared for the final battle of Ragnarok. This made Vikings fearless in battle. They were not afraid to die, and sometimes even strived for a heroic death. Imagine what it was like to fight an opponent who not only does not fear death, but welcomes it. For Christians, believing in afterlife retribution for sins, such an attitude seemed diabolical. This enhanced the mystical horror of Vikings. It seemed that they were under the patronage of dark forces. Technological superiority also played its role. Viking ships were a true marvel of engineering thought of their time. They could move both under sail and by oars, were fast, maneuverable, and at the same time strong enough for sea voyages. No other European power of that time had a fleet capable of matching the Viking fleet. This gave them a huge strategic advantage. They could attack anywhere and anytime, and then disappear just as quickly. Viking weapons also deserve a separate discussion. Their swords, made using the pattern welding technology, the so-called Damascus pattern, were among the best in Europe. But the main symbol of a Viking became the axe, a simple but effective weapon requiring minimum metal to manufacture. The wide blade of a battle axe could pierce a shield or armor, and in skilled hands was no less deadly than a sword. Moreover, the axe was also a working tool, versatility appreciated by the practical northerners. But perhaps the most terrible weapon of the Vikings was their reputation. Over time, just a rumor about the approach of the northern people could make entire villages flee in panic. The prayer, "Deliver us, O Lord," from the fury of the Northmen became popular in churches throughout Europe. Vikings skillfully used their reputation. Sometimes it was enough to just appear off the shores of a city for its inhabitants to agree to pay ransom without a fight. Interestingly, the Vikings themselves did not consider themselves particularly cruel. For them, raids were simply a way of obtaining resources and raising their status. In Scandinavian society of that time, wealth and glory gained in campaigns were the main indicators of a man's success. A young warrior wishing to marry or gain respect from his tribesmen simply had to go on a Viking raid and return with loot. It was part of their culture, as natural as getting an education or career growth is for us. Over time, Vikings became not only raiders, but also colonizers, traders, mercenaries, founders of states. They populated Iceland and Greenland, reached the shores of North America 5 centuries before Columbus, founded states on the territory of modern Russia, France, England, and served in the personal guard of Byzantine emperors. Their influence on European history is difficult to overestimate. Gradually, the image of the Viking destroyer gave way to the image of the Viking builder. By the 11th century, most Scandinavians had adopted Christianity. Their societies became more organized, and centralized kingdoms emerged. The era of classic Viking raids came to an end, but the memory of them and fear of them persisted for many centuries to come. So what made Vikings so frightening? A combination of factors: the suddenness of attacks, psychological warfare, combat mastery, fearlessness in the face of death, technological superiority at sea, and of course, a skillful black PR campaign by their victims. They were not superhumans or demons, just very effective warriors of their time whose reputation worked for them no worse than their axes and swords. Modern research shows that Vikings were a much more complex and multifaceted society than commonly thought. They created beautiful works of art, had developed mythology and poetry, maintained extensive trade connections. Women in their society had more rights than in many other European cultures of that time. They were not only destroyers, but also builders, not only warriors, but also farmers, craftsmen, seafarers, explorers. But the fear they caused was quite real, and this fear became part of their legacy, their historical image, which continues to excite our imagination even 1,000 years after the end of the Viking era. Perhaps that is why we are still so interested in them. They embody our dark fantasy of freedom from the constraints of civilization, of a life where strength and courage mean more than rules and conventions. So, to summarize, Vikings were frightening because they knew how to use fear as a weapon. They cultivated their intimidating image, employed tactics of sudden attacks, did not fear death, and had superiority at sea. Their reputation, enhanced by the stories of their victims, worked for them, making them even more frightening in the eyes of contemporaries. But behind this image of bloodthirsty barbarians was a complex culture with its own values, art, and achievements. Now I want to ask you, what historical myths about Vikings did you know before this video? What surprised you the most? Perhaps the fact about the absence of horned helmets, or the information that Vikings were clean and fashionable. Share your thoughts in the comments. I am really interested to know which stereotypes about Vikings are most common. If you enjoyed this journey into the world of Northern warriors, do not forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Click the bell so you do not miss upcoming episodes. Ahead of us await no less fascinating stories about other civilizations that changed the course of history. By the way, next time we will talk about a people whose empire was even more terrifying than any Viking fleet, but they did not leave a single written testimony about themselves. Intrigued? Then stay with us. And finally, perhaps the real strength of the Vikings was not in their axes and not in their ships, but in their ability to transform the fear of others into their main resource. After all, in the end, they conquered half of the known world not by numbers, but by skill. And perhaps the main lesson we can draw from their history is that reputation is sometimes stronger than reality, like the history of the Vikings themselves, which I have just told you.